Excellent. Let's get things underway. So I'll go into introductions first, starting with the judging panel. My name is Rob. I'll be your chair today. He is good. I'm going with the trainee, so I'll let them introduce themselves as well.
So sorry.
Are you there, Fatima?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Fatima. Good luck to everyone.
Thank you. We'll go around and do the teams now. I'll grab your name, your speaking position, and a pronoun if you wish, starting with the affirmative team, Auckland 1.
Hi, Umbar speaking first and reply, she, her.
Shah speaking second, he, they.
Grace, third, she, her.
Thank you. And the negative team, JGU 1.
Prathik is going first, Shakya is going second, and Devashish is going with. We'll let you know who's going to reply. Preferred gender. We do not have a preferred gender pronoun.
Too easy. Keep your secrets then, and we'll find out who the reply is later on. Now, my understanding is doing the motion about student sports being completely de-professionalised. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great. Just like to thank both teams for vetoing my two motions in this set today. Anyway, speaking times will be up to 8 minutes. I probably won't drop time signals in the chat because I'll be doing the judging, but do please time yourselves. If you speak for like 8:15, I will start clapping you off and not be paying attention to what you're saying. I also have two screens going, which is why it might look like I'm not paying attention, but it's just because I've got two monitors and people are like on the big monitor and I'm all spread out. So I'm not trying to be rude during the debate. If there are no further questions then, otherwise I think no other rules of debating have massively changed in the last hour since yesterday. So I'd like to invite the first speaker of the affirmative team to speak to the motion that stands in their name. Here.
Also, I'm just checking that you can hear me.
You're all loud and clear.
Perfect. Sorry about vetoing your motion, Rob. Professionalized student sports apply pressure on some of the most vulnerable people in society who are told that their coach's salary depends on their success, that their capacity to get a scholarship to attend a good university that would otherwise cost them thousands of dollars depends on the performance they put in on the field every time they go out. That is really harmful when sports should be something that makes people happy, that helps them bond with their schoolmates and gives them a sense of internal pride. I think it is harmful that sports has become professionalized to the point that it has for two main reasons. Firstly, it locks out a whole host of people from entering sports in the first place, which is important for the majority of people when you are able to prioritize things like health in a way that is fun and allows you to build community. But it also harms the people who get sucked into the cycle of chasing professional success at the expense of their grades, at the expense of their physical and mental well-being. We support de-professionalizing sports in all schools under our side of the house. In terms of model, we think this applies to all high school and university or college sports. It looks like everything that is highlighted in the info side. So implementing living wages, a maximum for coaches and staff, pooling revenue to cover reasonable costs for all schools that play sports, and putting those excess profits into charity so there's no profiteering for the schools that are winning games or able to sell things like television rights when those games are presented. The first point in our case is why this fixes some misallocation of resources at schools. I think the first thing I would note is that there is a huge incentive on schools and universities to double down on sports at the moment. They spend immense amounts of money on advertising, on coaching, scholarships, and facilities just to chase the potential for massive profits. And note that only a few universities or schools do benefit from that profit in that first place, but everyone is encouraged to spend that money because the potential payoff that you might access is incredibly high. We think that the comparative for schools and universities would be to reappropriate these funds and spend them on things like mental health resources for everyone or educational resources, because there is less of a massive financial benefit that is available for that success. And you can do things like attract reputational benefits from all of those other good facilities that you're able to set up. Why is increasing professionalism creating an immensely high barrier to entry in student sports? I think the first thing to note is that historically sports at school were often quite community-based and encouraged a social method of playing, people going out and kicking a ball in the field for a few hours once a week after school, or going to other schools in like matchups that were friendly rather than professionalized. And what I would note is that back in the old days when sports were less about about professionalization and the pipeline to getting scholarships or professional deals, more people were encouraged to take part in sports because it was something that was fun. It was a way to spend time with your friends without necessarily having to worry about if you made a fool of yourself in front of the entire school. Professionalization is a barrier to entry for, I think, 4 specific reasons. Firstly, I think people get incredibly scared away by the level of input that is required in order to play these sports. I think often professionalized sports involves the top teams training literally every single day after school for hours in order to get all of that team time in. So if you are someone who, say, wants to prioritize studying or wants to hang out with your friends once a week, or even maybe do other activities like debating every now and then, the cost of entry when you have to dedicate so much time, or it looks like you have to dedicate a lot of time, is immensely high, and it gives off an image that you are unable to do a lot of things if you prioritize sports, which means that people are often wary of entering team sports in the first place. But the second reason is that you often have to invest a lot at an incredibly young age in order to be able to compete. Most of the players that present the image of being like the top players in schools start playing their team sports when they are 5, when they are 4 years old, and it looks like if you are someone who's entering these sports at an older age, you will be unable to achieve the same level of success that these players have, and I think that makes a barrier to entry really high. Thirdly, I think that schools also often prioritize their top teams and both present them as the only team that matters, but spend most of their funding on those teams as well. It looks like, for example, in rugby, the first 11 gets a lot of resources spent on them and their training, but the second 11 might not be prioritized so much, or spending a lot of money on bringing in players from other schools that will be able to play in your top team, and not necessarily promoting social leagues as much, because you want the good players in your schools doing things like playing professionally for the best team that you have, and not just with their friends in a social league that will take their time away. I think the impact of this is that people are less likely to enter sports or see it as a viable option if they are not already good players or haven't spent a lot of time playing, because it seems like a cult around the people who are really good. I think the impacts of this are really harmful, right? Firstly, in terms of health, because obviously kids not entering sports at school means that they are unlikely to access one of the most fun ways to be able to participate in fitness and do things like just run around a field for a few hours while having a good time. But I think community is also incredibly important. The joy that you connect to playing sports at a young age is what helps you make friends and build a sense of bonding that is importantly tied to that sport and follows you into old age. So when you play social cricket at a young age and then meet people who also like cricket, that is something that bonds you regardless of any other factors that you might have. But I think this is especially important insofar as it is a fundamental part of sports that is increasingly gotten away from people as sports becomes entertainment based only. People sit at home alone to watch sports on the TV, but community is incredibly important. I think society becomes increasingly atomized when people forget that sports is something they can use as a social bonding tool and not just like a method for people who are really successful to play and everyone else to simply watch. I think on our side of the house, we reduce the pressure to get involved in sports, meaning that schools are more likely to widen the pools of people who start playing, because their drives to do things like pay for good kids to come to their schools have decreased. But you also just increase the level of accessibility because good players are able to do things like convince their friends to come along and play in social leagues and unlock all of those important benefits, both in health and community. Finally, in terms of why most students who enter the pipeline for professional sports are harmed, I think the first thing to note is that most players who want to play professionally probably will not succeed and make sacrifices for a false pathway. Obviously, everyone who plays in high school is often hoping for a scholarship that will be able to save them thousands of dollars on university education if they are able to attract scouts. So they prioritize things like putting in hours and hours to practice the sport that they are playing, but very few people are actually able to get like a scholarship good enough to make up for all of the like harms that accrue to their grades and education, which is obviously harmful for a few reasons. I think firstly, all the time that you sink on playing those competitive games increases your risk of things like sporting injuries, which are obviously really harmful for young players because they're often long-term when they happen when you're young. Lots of football players have like consistently dislocated shoulders because they break those muscles or bones when they're young, and that makes it difficult for them. But it also just means that your grades probably suffer in comparison to people that make that time priority in a different way. The second group to note, though, is the people that do make it but probably do not get the equal benefits of education and sports. I think often when you are quite good at sports at high school, you were told that a university scholarship is going to let you get both a great degree and also play competitive sports. But often you're funneled into degrees like health science that relate to the sport you're playing, but probably do not help you get jobs at that point anyway. So you end up sacrificing a lot of your career in a world where you're not able to play professionally when you leave university anyway. But insofar as you are good, you probably can play professionally for clubs and make money without necessarily sinking all that time into education. But I think the final thing to say is that pressure from schools means that you often play to the point of injury. And this applies to all players, regardless of if you make it or not. Because when profit is on the line or scholarship is on the line, you probably push yourself to the point of burnout. I think the incentives to apply these pressures both internally and externally decrease when sports becomes de-professionalized. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to welcome the first negative speaker to open the case to the negative team. Here.
Hi, I hope I'm audible. Just checking.
All loud and clear.
Thank you.
Prathik, can you check the WhatsApp chat once?
Yeah, all good. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Panel, I think government or affirmative to a large extent actually doesn't get this motion correct, because I think when they're talking about student sports being professionalized, we're necessarily talking about individuals in high school or in university sports who are extremely good, who play in like in like student in high school or university leagues like the NCAA, the young NBA, young NBL, and so on and so forth. It's not necessarily about all individuals who casually play the sports in general, because I think that'll regardless happen anyway, because they're still attracted to it because it's fun, as PM says. So I don't necessarily see how it's largely about casual people who casually play sports, but rather about student athletes who participate in these leagues, etc. So secondly, we also think that individuals are less likely to be scared away because they're still likely to participate or play the sports on a general basis because they think it's fun and a good pastime activity. So I don't think a large amount of the material in terms of like health and exercise necessarily like something that stands in this debate. But moreover, I think like people joining it or joining high school sports in general and wasting time, resources, like yada yada yada, etc., will still continue to happen because the vast majority of students still will like pursue sports out of like innate talent as well as like love for the game. So I think that's just likely to happen in either world. But I think in their world necessarily it's not as lucrative and not necessarily a viable career option or a life path. The point in time college sports or high school sports are necessarily de-professionalized, right? A bunch of material first then, right? Why do we considerably prefer a world in which where student sports are necessarily professionalized, in that a larger amount of money is spent in terms of the staff, larger amount of money is spent in the coaching, larger amount of money is offered to students in the form of student contracts, like how massive amounts of money are given to student athletes in the NCAA or in the young NBA, young NBL, or even FIFA Junior, right? We think for all of these reasons, we think firstly, training is significantly better by virtue of the fact that more money is pumped in to these particular student sports. They have better training, better coaches because they're able to afford them, like you're able to afford better coaches because you're able to pay them larger sums of money. But moreover, like ancillary staff which are particularly vital to sports, such as health staff, which not only increase the lifespan of players, are also be able to be afforded in the first place and less likely to be cut in their world, wherein you have less amount of money in the first place. So you have the ability in our world to not only hire more health staff, which not only like ensures that the lifespan of a player increases drastically, but also helps prevent injury. Whereas in their world, when they're de-professionalized and there is a less amount of money available, you're likely to not have the ability to hire the staff anyway. But secondly, in terms of the student athlete, right? I think firstly, it's important to note that the temporal limitations on student athletes and athletes in general is extremely high, in that an individual is in their physical peak ability from the ages of like 16 to 30 at best. We think at that point in time, it's necessarily important for athletes to like cultivate their entire sporting ability or their athletic career at a relatively young age. To that extent, panel, we think to the extent that individuals need to enter or themselves feel the ability feel the ability to enter sports, they want to do so and are increasingly doing so at a younger age. To that extent, panel, we think that firstly, the idea of pressure is symmetric because individuals in any field, if they want to pursue it competitively, whether it be like joining engineering or joining law or like even academic pursuits, or if they want to join sports, necessarily will feel a certain degree of pressure in either world. And given that we're talking predominantly about student athletes who participate in leagues as such, will still likely to feel pressure in either world. We think that's just like symmetric and part of life. But moreover, we think uniquely the point in time you're deprofessionalized student athletics, individuals and athletes from poorer backgrounds are significantly more disadvantaged. Because panel note, sports in general is a massively equalizing factor because it takes into account things like innate talent and a natural ability to play a sport. That's precisely why you have a large amount of individuals who are from more impoverished backgrounds or from significantly disadvantaged groups who are able to equally participate in sports, because things like generational wealth and like certain advantages that you're born into are not as applicable in sport apart from like innate physical ability. To that extent, the point in time you make student athletics significantly less lucrative and you have student contracts not being paid as high, you don't have as much training. Necessarily individuals who now from disadvantaged communities, who often sports is a way out from them, from literally out of poverty, such as in several instances like in the NBA, whether it be Zion Williamson or Kevin Durant or so on and so forth, several individuals from disadvantaged communities who literally did not have the money to sustain their household were massively now suddenly paid huge student contracts, which not only allowed them to pursue a sporting career in the first place in the form when they were from high school to university, but B also allowed for them to actually participate and engage in the sports fully, because it was now not viewed as a waste of time, but something that actually provided their family a sustenance. So the barrier of parents allowing their children to participate in sports is also removed the point in time you have a larger amount of money being given to student athletes by virtue of the fact it's professionalized. We think to that extent, the point in time you have them deprofessionalized, not only you have less amount of money actually being paid to student athletes, but we also think it's less likely for student athletes to actually actively engage in university athletics as a whole, to the extent that parents are less likely to allow them because they don't see it as something that is beneficial to their children, in that it's not enough money being given, or that if you're from a particularly if you're from a poorer family, there is a significantly larger amount of there's significantly less amount of money, or the amount of trade-offs you have to make in terms of the fact that you have to not be able to work a part-time, you have to work a part-time job because you simply do not have the money to pursue athletics as a whole. Whereas in our world, you're also paid a huge amount of money to participate in student athletics. Thus, you don't not only have less skill, but you also have less familial pressure and actually allowed to participate in sports in the first place. To fourth instance, we think that student athletes are less pressured to make bad decisions economically. That is to say, in a rush to gain financial security, which is something that happens to student athletes in their side, they're likelier to make riskier decisions, such as going in from high school in the United States, going and deciding to play in Europe, which has happened in several instances for college basketball players, in the fact that they're in the search or the pursuit for financial security, they make significantly riskier and more rash decisions. I think to a large extent, this is also due to the fact that they feel a larger amount of personal guilt, to the extent that given the fact that they're being paid less amount of money, college athletics and pursuing them is something that is less lucrative. So internally, there's always a pressure in that they have to continuously go and make quicker and more rash decisions. This is less likely to happen in our world, to the extent that college athletics is something that has a larger amount of money and you can participate it without feeling the same level of guilt. But secondly, I think to the extent if they're going to go ahead and argue that donating to profit to non-sport charities is a good thing, I mean, I think it will generate significantly less amount of money because there's going to be less viewership, because less student athletes participate in it because it's not as lucrative, and B, there's less amount of money being spent on media and getting people into stadiums. So I think as a whole, the amount of money being given to or generated as a whole decreases. So I think, but secondly, it also shirks the state burden in terms of ameliorating individuals living conditions in the first place. So I think to that extent, I don't think this is something that is particularly relevant in this debate. But moving on to misallocation and less popular sports, I think this is worse in their world, to the extent that if you're decreasing the overall pool of money, it's likely that less popular sports are likely to receive an even smaller piece of the pie, because the size of the pie as a whole is being reduced. I think this is relatively easy intuition. But moreover, I think women's sports and more less less mainstream sports are likely to receive less amounts of money, to the extent there is overall less amount of funding available. This is particularly problematic because like parents in the developing world and societies which are generally against saying women athletes going ahead and playing sports are less likely to allow their children to do so. The point in time, it's not viewed as a lucrative outcome or something that is likely to give them a large amount of money. For all of these reasons, negate.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd now like to invite the second affirmative speaker to continue the case for the F bench. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Awesome. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If you think about professionalization, it's not something you often connect to students and individuals who are in very impressionable early stages of life, whose bodies and minds aren't fully developed. It's weird then that you'd be okay with professionalized sports for those individuals that often incur some of the highest stress and the most risky behavior in order to try and get some goal in the future of playing professionally to earn enough money to cover that sunk cost that a lot of individuals have never ever get the access to. And that's the actual problem, right? Because the goal of trying to play sports is also fine on our side of the house, even if it's not professionalized, because now more people are able to casually play sport and incur the benefits that are inherent to playing sport itself. The opportunity cost that a lot of individuals face in the status quo is the risky behavior that Umbar characterized to you with no response. I'm going to do some reframing a little bit because they kind of very lazily try to say, oh, this is not about casual players and wastage still happens, but then go into why it's important that more people play sports and that'll happen on our side and impact that a little bit more. And secondly, deal with the few benefits of some individuals having scholarships and other benefits that come for playing professionalized sports and weighing that up for you in order to show why AF wins this debate. The first thing to note about casual players is their only response to the 4 levels that Umbar provided to you as to why in the status quo people are less likely to play sports casually, because all of the funding and pressure goes into professionalized elements of that sports in schools, and therefore it kind of undervalues and underfunds things like amateur sports, like social leagues, but also scares people away when they are no longer able to do things like play sports like once a week, but instead if they are in that team, they need to go to training every single time, or they're letting the team down, which means people aren't doing that. Their only response was, oh, people still play because they're attracted to it, right? And that is not a good enough response, because yes, people are attracted to it, but are daunted by all of the mechanisms that Umbar brought to you, which means that they don't want to play in the structured manner that comes about because of the professionalization of sports at schools. On our side, we actually provide those important benefits to those students. What are those important benefits, right? One is just health, in like the ability to have a fun way of exercising that will solve a lot of the problems of like the obesity epidemic that's sweeping the goal, that leads to actual real life quality of life decreasing in the future with heart diseases, etc. But also benefits mental health, the extent that there are endorphins that are able to be released when you play sports, and you're no longer able to be sucked into a cycle of not playing sports, but instead just watching sports for entertainment and not getting involved in that. And also, I think really importantly, impact the community and social benefits of that. So already that point in terms of why we get a broader accessibility in sports, especially for young students, being able to get that benefit that is inherently important for them in their young developing years is really important, right? Because even to the extent that they provide on their side of the house some extra benefits to the most talented individuals that are likely to get scholarships, then go to university and are lucky enough to be able to make a career in sports. No, think about the number of people that play professional sports at schools versus the number of people that play professional sports as a career and actually can make long-term money out of that. There's a very small percentage of those individuals that actually ever make it big in their side of the house, which means the majority of people all around the world that are now more likely to play sports and significantly change their quality of life exponentially, cumulatively as they grow older, is already a debate-winning outcome for us. Now I'm going to talk about the impacts to athletes in the status quo. The first thing to note is in terms of the incentives of students, right? Because they want to say that you are able to, actually, firstly, I want to deal with something they said about sports being better, right? That you get better training and better coaches, and ancillary staff are less likely to be cut. The first thing to note is that we are unclear as to why better training and better coaches are important, because we don't necessarily want student sports to be like very, very good. We don't want them to be professionalized. You're still able to get the entertainment value of sports by watching like leagues, by watching clubs, by watching national level sports that still have good coaches and training. We want to trade off the small level entertainment value of these individuals being good at, or like particularly good at sports because of their coaches, with the harms that we provided to you already. But also in terms of ancillary staff, like medical staff, for example, we're not going to cut them necessarily, because you're still paying them what they need to be paid. So we'll pay doctors the wages that they need to be paid to ensure that students are safe. But we also think, based on the analysis that we've shown you, that you're less likely to overtrain, overwork, and put your students into riskier situations because your own money as a coach depends on it, or your prestige and money as an institution like university or school depends on it. Means you get fewer injuries on our side. Note that this is not just a small harm, right, of injury, but like a torn axle or a stretched hamstring can have real quality of life harms forever, right? Irreversible harms, in the sense that you will be unable to walk around sometimes. So if you get concussions playing NFL at a young age, you are less likely to have the ability to do anything in a mental capacity, more likely to, for example, to get like harmful deterioration in your mental capacity, which means you are unable in the long term even to have any sort of meaningful existence. You forget your grandchildren. That is the kind of harm that they focus on a lot of individuals, not just the individuals that actually make up for that by getting any sort of benefit on their side of the house. Let's talk about the equity part of this, right? So they say sports is the best way to ensure that individuals are able to access benefits. The first thing to note in the analysis about people from poorer backgrounds being able to access these benefits is it's just not really true, right? Like the examples of Serena and Venus are just what it is, right? Just examples. 99% of NBA players come from middle class or upper class individuals, families. You don't necessarily get people from like the slums of Harlem coming and playing for the NBA. Because why is it the case? Because wealth actually does matter in your ability to train, right? You need to have the time to play. You need the investment at a young age, especially when it becomes professionalized, for individuals to have the skills to make it to those big teams and therefore get more skills and exponentially increase, right? Which means you need the parents with money and wealth to pay for private trainers, to pay for the ability to go to those facilities, to pay for gyms, those kinds of things. Note that it's far more inequitable when there are incentives on those kinds of rich parents to put that effort into their children when sports becomes professionalized, because you're able to make a lot of money, make a lot of statements when you are at a young age. It's much more equitable on our side because you're able to play at a relatively lower level, a more social level, improve those skills together because there's much more distributed investment in funding, not just within a school, but around schools in all different geographical areas. So you actually increase the accessibility of professional sports after schools for the majority of individuals and the majority of poorer individuals, right? So that's why it's important to note that on our side, people can still access sports. They still, if they feel keenly involved in sports, they're able to go to that. We think that your physical peak should not start at 15 because there are irreversible harms when you're harmed as a child, but this should start when you're older, right? When you're after university. And that's why you don't specialize even in academic pursuits when you're in high school. You still have time to make the decision. Even when you're doing law in the US, for example, you do it after you graduate. And that is important because we are allowing individuals who have all those opportunities instead of getting stuck into sports that they might not actually succeed in, because only very few people actually achieve the benefits they're talking about. But also sports, as we've already discussed, are much more harmful. You get injured playing sports. You don't get injured doing your maths homework or law, for example. This means that risky decisions are actually much more harmful on their side of the house. Firstly, I'm not sure who can afford to go to Europe under their side of the house, or if that's ever going to happen, given that this is a global policy, so you're not necessarily having capital flight or risky decisions. Risky decisions happen far more on their side of the house, given Umbar's analysis about how the same pressure they say that now parents are pushing on children to do this comes from the idea that you might make it big. But if people don't make it big, and a vast majority of people don't make it big, all of the harms that we brought you apply on their side of the house. So just weigh up the some people that are able to make it big, maybe slightly more likely on their side of the house versus everyone that we prevent from making those kinds of risky decisions that already happen in the status quo.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to welcome a negative speaker to communicate to the negative bench. Here.
I hope I'm audible.
You're
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. As I read the motion, I was reminded of a very favorite South Park episode wherein Cartman refers to student athletes as forced laborers. While this analogy might be a bit exaggerated, I think it rightfully points out to the disproportionate manner in which colleges and institutions alike benefit from this program of student athletes on side government, where the only ones to lose out are actual students, people who actually come from backgrounds that might be middle class according to like government's like characterization, but from what I've seen in the world predominantly are from families that are not as well off or are vulnerable. On negative, we seek to remedy this. There are 2 things I'm going to specifically argue in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to show to you that the status quo as it exists on side government as well already favors the biggest colleges and the best sports players. Therefore, it's already as competitive as they would want to characterize it to be in our world, showing that a lot of the harms that they say either symmetrically accrue or are not mitigated simply because you don't allow these people to have money in the very first place to mitigate them. Secondly, I'm just going to very dead on give a comparative as to why making less money is worse off for these students and not do speculative bullshit about how casually viewing the sport and casually engaging with sport is suddenly derailed. 2 clarifications though before that. First, I think they try to pin this on us and say that you now put additional physical strain upon people and now you're more prone to injury. I think they want you to believe that physical harm stems only from money, except notice like people still get injured within sports, especially like student sports. And notice that this can be attributed to the rigorous playing schedules that exist on both sides of this debate. Athletes have to go and play a lot of matches, and it's especially competitive when you have scouts checking out your like performance on a regular basis, which is why athletes push them to a great extent. Look, I want to point out that the reason they do it is because they want to play eventually in the big leagues and maybe also make money. And this reasoning exists on both sides. And since this incentive exists on both sides, I think the propensity of athletes going ahead and injuring them is equal. The question, therefore, in this debate is what do they do the point at which they have injured themselves and they don't have any fucking money as side government would have you deal with them, but would have you believe. But second thing I want to clarify is the idea that you stop playing sports casually. Look, even before this motion, like I think sports as an activity on a student level has always been competitive. Certain students are ahead of others and are preferred by scouts who come to visit certain schools and are often given a push and edge by their gym teachers or literally by their school simply because they realize there's a certain sporting acumen within that person. That competitive nature, which is also, by the way, driven by money because they want to become big players in the future and make a shit ton of money, is also something that exists on side government, but it doesn't take away from the fact that people continue to play cricket, basketball, or football casually, because to a lot of people who are not actually athletes, they do engage sports casually, and we don't see any analysis in 2 speeches as to why it's likely to derail them. I think competition exists, but like there are still niches where people continue to engage in sports casually simply because it's a social activity and people want to do so. Therefore, on my first argument, why is this already like extremely competitive the way government construes them to, and therefore like something that like that is like disadvantages to players as a whole? Firstly, I think what you need to notice is that at best, like colleges still continue to give stuff as like scholarships and other things, wherein it's evident how the biggest colleges continue to benefit. Say Ohio State, Illinois State, or Purdue consistently have given the biggest scholarships. And even if this debate was not about like paying these people directly and only about giving like rewarding them through incentives, certain competition continues to exist because big players continue to benefit from this. They already have massive scouting networks set up all across nations, which uniquely benefit these people, which means the competitive nature of sports that Affirmative complains about is already one that's created because of these forces existing, devoid of any considerations of how much we pay the student athletes in the first place. Secondly, notice that you have immense competition at the school level too, because much like education, you compete with other students. A lot of students prepare from a young age to be a scholar or a doctor, and this is as competitive as sports where someone might want to become an athlete later on. This is because parents want you to play sports only if you might be able to have a career in it later. For you to pursue this in college, you must at least show that there's an acumen of sports within you that gives you a competitive edge over others, which means that the kind of competition and pressure that exists on our side equally exists on side affirmative, except there is no specific reward that these people get for it, simply have to put on continuous efforts because they have a dream to realize. Third, even if we were to argue that, like, you know, there are like huge costs incurred, and if like it's better off to not pay these athletes, notice that even if we don't give money to these institutions, there are various ways through which they still benefit. Firstly, let's not even consider financial benefits. Notice that the goodwill added to these colleges and the kind of reputation that is generated, the point at which you have these athletes playing in your colleges, means not only are you as a college likely to have more applicants in the future, you're likely to get more investors, sponsors, donors, all that jazz too. What does this mean? This means that the competition faced by students and the kind of efforts that they need to put to excel is symmetric in both worlds, except while everyone else continues to benefit from these, the student and the sporting staff are the ones that make the least money. Therefore, we think the important question in hand in this debate is, should these sports people be rewarded with incentives such as the ones that maybe like Affirmative would want to clearly offer in GovWhip, or should they be given salary and like fees the way you play professional athletes? Why on a comparative do we think we are better off? First, and okay, here's a clarification. Gov says that this has a drastic effect on the mental health and the physical health of sports person. I've already shown to you the physical aspect of it is attributed to the competitive nature of the sport, which exists on both sides. We think on the mental end, this pressure has already existed because you want to excel and you want to be better. Therefore, you push yourself both physically and mentally because of how competitive sports is. But we think the problem accrues the point at which you like make student athletes put in so much pressure upon themselves without necessarily creating an avenue through which they can be rewarded. There are multiple reasons as to why this needs to be taken into considerations. Like, I think Prathik has already given you ample reason as to how this benefits people from like vulnerable communities. And the only shady response we get from DPM is, oh, here's the thing, a lot of people come from middle-class backgrounds. Absolutely a lie. Not only most players from NBA belong to vulnerable communities, but notice that in developing countries such as India, China, and all of these people, a lot of these sports people come from rural areas where like education isn't bolstered as much as you would find sports to be. So firstly, why is this money important? It's because athletes are prone to injuries, and not just injuries that accrues from money. You cut down the longevity of their career, you add financial burdens, and you need this money to stay safe. On a comparative, this money is much better than whatever incentives you can offer on side Affirmative, because these incentives are quite intangible and speculative. You can't know what a scholarship will turn into because you don't know for sure whether a person might get a job, the point at which colleges offer. The stability that actual money can create in the life of these athletes can simply not be replicated on side Affirmative. And this is something they need to deal with without just saying that, oh, casually playing sports suddenly becomes difficult. But second consideration in this debate is how likely are parents to encourage this. I think outside USA and Europe, college education is a very flimsy concept. But more importantly, sports is only encouraged when people see an actual benefit coming from this. We think this benefit accrues the point at which you add money to this when you put a monetary value to it. Extremely proud to negate.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now to begin to wrap up the same speeches, I'd like to welcome the third affirmative speaker. You're here.
Oh, no.
Oh, here, I'll give you time later. Yes, please.
I'll just start my speech with a little clarification for the team, which is that obviously we do not support giving students scholarships to play professional sports at high school or university level, right? And I think it's false to assume that the status quo is one where students get paid an income to play for their college team, right? You get paid in a scholarship, but that scholarship doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a job. It means you have to stay at a school for 4 years and accrue the cost of doing so instead of actually playing for a competitive team where you might make an income. You put your life on the line, you are at risk of injury and harming your career just because you think that you can have the best of both worlds and get a degree, which is probably worthless. That's terrible. 3 things in my speech. Firstly, focusing on disadvantaged groups. Secondly, about access to sports. And thirdly, about injury. Firstly, disadvantaged players. I think their best point in this debate is probably just that you provide a pathway for impoverished students. 3 clear responses to this. Firstly, obviously, in our world, we think universities and high schools are less incentivized to pour heaps of money into building new fields, into getting new vans to transport your rugby team around. And instead, they're putting that money towards things that actually look good on their prospectus to new students and look good in terms of social utility. So that might mean reallocating money to other scholarships, which are not based on sport, but based on academic potential and about helping, people who are less financially able. What this means is minority students are more likely to get a scholarship on our side, and crucially, it may be a scholarship that doesn't come with a condition of you having to play on the university sports team, so you get to focus on your degree, you get to do a more intensive degree that might interest you and may actually lead to a proper career that pays you at the end of it. Second response, and this is what Shah told you when he talked about how 99% of the MBA comes from middle or upper class families. Yes, second negative. Obviously, they're vulnerable, but that's because they're Black and they face systematic racism. It's not necessarily because they're poor, right? Black middle-class families have the financial means to be able to pay for their kid to have a good coach when they're 12, to be able to pay for their kid to have good equipment, to feel like they belong in the sports field, to be able to have the confidence to travel to different areas, to play in tournaments, to get themselves scouted, right? That obviously does not apply to poorer families. And I think there's an incredibly pervasive false narrative that, lots of poor people make it through playing sports and they get their family out of poverty. And it is this myth which the media focuses on because the media loves a rags to riches story. But this lie actually cons impoverished people into encouraging their children to not take classes as seriously as playing for the big game on the weekend. So that means you have students who are probably vulnerable that should probably just get their GED or just graduate high school, instead not making those assignments finished and just going to their games. And I think that is a bigger harm for the vast majority of vulnerable people in this debate. But third response here is let's just talk about the benefit to those students that do get through because of innate talent. The first thing to say here is that if they are innately talented at sports, I don't think giving them a scholarship to university is as big of a benefit as the negative team wants to say. And that's because, like I flagged in my introduction, that scholarship is all the money you get. You don't get paid income and you have to risk your body. So that might risk your future career as a professional player. But also when you're at university, you have to pay for other stuff, right? You have to pay for the cost of living in a college town and getting accommodation and, going out with all these people that are from a different income class than you. That's very difficult for you to put up, to keep up with. And also note that at the end of it, you don't get a meaningful degree that will be well paying. You get a degree in something like health psychology because that complements your scholarship and that makes it easier for you to be able to fulfill both of your obligations, right? So at the end of that degree, you can't do anything that might actually allow you to earn to your full potential. If these players have innate talent, we think it's better that they don't go to university, that they just go and play club sport, or they just go straight into professional leagues because they're innately talented, so they have the opportunity. And that's where they can make an income, they can actually get a job that pays and helps their family. Second point then about making sports more accessible. I'm going to start off by defending our material about how lots of people are scared off school sports because they're so competitive and because schools focus their attention on top teams. I think first negative says sports are fun, so this point is symmetric. Obviously, something's not symmetric just because you've pointed out another reason. We think we make sports less scary, which the other team hasn't engaged with. But also, because sports are fun, I think in the status quo, we have a tendency to think of them as sports for good people to play, and we have fun watching them. But I actually think I'd be a sick rugby player, and in a world where sports were de-professionalised, I would be encouraged to go and join a uni team and actually put my body out there and, try something new that may be good for my mental health, right? Second negative says some students are still going to be, competitive. But crucially here, we remove a very specific external pressure that acts on coaches, that acts on school systems. And that's the external pressure that forces people to play. That means they put all the funding into the top teams instead of the social teams, right? Obviously, we think when you remove that, people still face internal pressure to do well, but I crucially think the school doesn't make your team feel like the shit team, you don't feel discouraged when you only make the second or third 15. You still feel like there's a point to you playing, you're just in a different team. I think that whole hierarchy isn't alienating to you. What they say on their side is that actually, if sports is less lucrative, then poor parents in particular will not let their children play sport. Firstly, I don't think this is true. If sports is lucrative, that is only true for a small group of people. So I think most parents who are really, really concerned about their children's success probably don't let their kids play sport anyways, but we think it's probably best for them if they just focus on school anyways. But crucially, what I tell you is that on our side of the house, by making sports less professional, you don't require kids in school sports teams to play or to go to trainings every single weekday and to have warm-ups for 2 hours before their weekend games. That means that it's a much lesser time commitment, so you are more likely to let your kid play if it means they don't have to sacrifice studying after school. That's great because those kids get to access things that might benefit them. Next thing I want to deal with is that I think the best case for the negative in this point is actually that they managed to prove that schools put less funding to sports. But I just want to say, firstly, I think this funding is going to be more equitable than in their world, right? Because in their world, they're probably more likely to cut funding from women's sports to fund men's sports because there's greater financial returns on men's sports, right? Because those are the games that are televised, so you can sell the television rights to them. I think on the other hand, when you're just funding sports because you care about, school pride, because you care about having a healthy co-curricular prospectus to show on your college brochure, you are more likely to fund sports equitably. But secondly, even if you get less funding for sports, I don't think that matters because you don't actually need a heap of funding. You don't need to fund huge, like the best coaches to come and make your sports league the most competitive. You only need enough funding to pay for the equipment and to maybe get a coach to turn up or a ref to turn up on the day, right? And this model literally allows for that because you reallocate money from, the best schools. You prevent them from, hoarding funds and you make them reinvest it, or you reallocate it in a pooled fund, or you donate that money to charity, right? We think that this is far more equitable. The benefits of sports can be accessed by everybody. That's something we're proud to offer. Finally, just on injury. Look, obviously, we've proved that you get less pressure on students to overperform and injure themselves, right? And that's not just because you reduce extrinsic pressures, but also because you reduce the internal pressure an athlete faces when they feel like they have to go play in the big game on the weekend, because that's where the scouts might be that will get them into university, that will guarantee their future. So they play beyond the point of safety and comfort and they hurt themselves. Obviously, when we reduce those pressures, you don't need to worry about funding health staff to come and look after those kids. Very, very proud to de-professionalize sports.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the third negative speaker for a substantial portion of today's debate. Here.
Checking if I'm audible.
Yep, you're audible.
All right, just give me 10 seconds. I'll set up my timer. All right, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Apps world is a world wherein people just play games like hide and seek because there is a less risk of injury, and that's pretty much it. There is no joy in that particular sports as such. There is no incentive for people to go ahead and actively participate in sports which actually have a higher risk of injury, and there is literally no incentive for parents to actually make their kids prioritize sports or any other activity over academics. The likelihood of academic success is something which is never proven in either of their speeches, so they can't actually make a comparative claim that the people will be better off academically in their world. I'll just deal with all the possible arguments they made in this particular speech and make one very important observation in the end, which can be actually the silver bullet argument for us. First, on misallocation of resources. I think misallocation of resources is rather manageable with the accountability measures in the place, which we have already discussed in our first speech, which would be much, much worse in their world, because now there is no actual money involved, as money actually invites some sort of scrutiny in such particular leagues. In their world, since there is a limited resources being funneled, there's literally no reason for government or other sporting authorities to care about small scale corruption or discrimination which occurs as the quantum of impact is so less for anyone to be prosecuted or any scandal to be investigated. Sure, schools will deprioritize allocation of resources to education, but that deprioritization happens after they have a larger pool of investment at their disposal, after they earn from those particular sporting events. That is to say, likelihood of education and infrastructure to be better off is still more in our world in comparison to theirs, because nowhere in their speeches have they explained how they enable a sustained funneling of resources to these particular poor schools. They claim in their whip that there will be more equitable funding in sports in their world, which in and of itself is a late matter, but still never prove how exactly there is going to be sustained or increased funding enabled in their world from any particular sources, as a matter of fact. They might try to slide some argument in their reply speech, ignore that. Then they come up and argue that more people take part in sports when it's fun and when there is a sense of community. But understand, the sports will always remain a fun community activity, and rather will have an increased palatability when students see their fellow friends actually being successful at different levels of sports league, etc. As even the smallest of the success signals a sense of pride and community in these particular schools, as these students consider their friends as a direct inspiration in comparison to some sports icon whom they've actually never seen. Then they come up and argue that top teams train daily and don't study at all. Like, the likelihood of these students to participate in their world is even worse when there is no incentive for students to participate in sports. Either they themselves will prioritize academics or will be forced by their parents to do so. Parents in developing areas will specifically restrict their kids, particularly women, because there is literally no sense of pride or return on investment or monetary incentive coming from this particular activity. Where Affirmative loses this debate is on not proving the comparative as to how they enable better academic performances in their world when schools don't even get additional sources of income from these particular sporting events, through which they can actually hire better staff, teachers, etc. Even in our worst case, at least students who are not that well off in academics get an avenue to showcase their talent in our world. Compare this to their world, wherein everyone just studies because no other activity is as important as academics. Then they come up and talk about things like, for example, risk of injury. But understand, the risk of injury will still exist in their world, especially when they claim that more people are going to play in their world. The situation gets worse when no attention is given to such injuries, as there is a dearth of resources. It's even worse when few players who have higher likelihood of success and have performed historically better off in comparison to other players are prioritized and cared for in comparison to those who have not been so successful. Thus, even if there is a net increase in people casually playing sports in their world, understand that not everyone is going to be given medical care they need for their injuries. In the worst case, the parents of these particular people are the ones who have to spend their own money to tend to these particular injuries, which further disincentivizes the players and the parents to participate in the sports in and of itself. Lack of resources doesn't just cause discrimination in terms of attending to injuries, but also in terms of team selection, training time given to the players, etc. As those who are well off and can pay a premium via private coaching, etc., are the ones who would only be the ones accessing these particular sporting activities. On the idea of success being limited, sure, the likelihood of success may be less in our worst case, but the success exists in a spectrum, wherein students are given an avenue to earn money right from the high school level, get a higher possibility of scholarship based on their sporting merit, which enables the student who may not be academically that well off, still having a chance to get to the good colleges and subsequently have a decent career options, which they still not have in their world, because everyone is going to compete for a need-based or an academic scholarship. How is the likelihood of success in sports or in academics more in their world is something they had to prove at least in their speech, but it's not done that. So they actually lose out this particular debate on that particular front. Even if there is an incentive to participate in sports, high school sports person in their world belonging from vulnerable backgrounds never get a decent training, equipment, or infrastructure to kickstart their sporting careers, either because there is zero to no resources to help them grow, there is discrimination, and hence they go ahead and either have to spend their own money to start playing sports so late in their life that it's counterproductive. As responsibilities increase, ability to learn new activities decrease, and risk of injury increases as the life progresses. That is to say, even if there is some people who start playing sports at their 25, obviously they're not going to be as successful as people in our world. When they talk about things like scholarship and money being inconsequential, the money earned from the sports and sports-centric scholarships is what creates a level playing field where either a student from vulnerable community can showcase their talent and receive a scholarship or have enough disposable income for their university education. None of this exists in their world. People belonging to middle and upper class have a better chance to get a part-time jobs and obtain academic scholarship because of their backgrounds. The situation then becomes worse in their world, wherein everyone is just trying to compete for these particular scholarships and vulnerable communities are left out. The last thing that they say is that players feel some sort of a pressure to do well. Well, at least they voluntarily choose an activity with an immense support base, which will be there for them in the times of let's say hardship, in the times wherein they are actually failing. Because it's not just that these people are doing this particular activity alone, or these people do not have any sort of inspiring factors, etc., involved in their process. People do take inspiration, people do have fan following, and it is at that point of time, even if you're failing, you still have some people to get back to. This doesn't exist in their world because everyone is pursuing academics, creating a sense of toxic competition within classrooms, especially when there is a dearth of resources. Now, one very crucial observation. Notice how Affirmative never actually deals with the one part of their burden, that is donation to the charities. Understand that even if there is some charity involved in their particular world, it's far worse and counterproductive when viewership falls, when people stop participating in sport and stop considering high school or university level sport as important as a proper professional sport as such. And if that is the case, even if they come ahead and claim that we at least get scholars, we at least get donations to charities and get some vulnerable communities well off in their reply speech, that is actually not the case, because the net income which can be obtained from these particular sporting activity is far less because there is less viewership and less participation. Compare this to our world. There is increased viewership, there is increased participation, and there is increased scrutiny. And that particular money can actually be funneled to things like scholarship for these particular students as such, thus increasing the likelihood of overall success for these particular individuals in terms of monetary benefits, in terms of academic scholarships, etc. In all, people play hide and seek in their world, and that's pretty much it. People actually have a likelihood of success while pursuing sports as a passion, and therefore our world is significantly better off in comparison to theirs. Proud to negate.
Thank you for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the negative replier to begin the reply portion of the debate, in which the speaking times will be halved and the speaking order reversed. Here.
Yeah, I hope I'm audible.
Negative reply, you good to go?
Yeah, sorry, just setting up my timer. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Let's reframe this debate and let's look at it from the perspective of what it's actually about. Firstly, which team actually told you what the professionalization of sport necessarily looks like? I think Affirmative does nothing on this, to the extent that only in first speech in opposition do we tell you this looks like participation in leagues, how individuals are paid huge student contracts where they're literally given money, by the way, which they're somehow construed to be like, oh, students aren't directly given money. They are, like Zion Williamson's student contract is worth $80 million, but in university. But besides the point, how they're given scholarship, how they're given professional training in a school or university student atmosphere, and all of those reasons, right? None of which like Affirmative necessarily tells you, nor do they engage with the bulk of the material coming out from negative, in that how it's necessarily a way out for students coming from poverty, in that not only do they have ability to pursue sport in the short term, given the fact they're getting massive student contracts or scholarships to actually attend large universities in the first place, and then like the only counter assertion we get from Affirmative to say that, oh, the NBA and like professional sport leagues just have like mostly middle class and upper middle class people, which I think is just like a blatant lie. Like you can like Google this. I don't know how to respond to this other than say that it's just factually incorrect. You can look at KD's speech in 2014 where he talks about this during his MVP acceptance. But moving on, right? We also think to the extent that also, given the fact that sports appears more lucrative as a industry while you're pursuing your career as a student, or while you're being a student in university or high school, it allows parents to necessarily like allow their children to actually participate in sport and overcome certain biases against participating in sport, particularly benefiting individuals from like more conservative communities who might allow their kids to participate in sports because they see it not only as a way in which it's a way out of the poverty trap, but also the fact that it's something that they can overcome their own biases, which prevent them from allowing their children from participating in sport. Moreover, there's also less guilt, internal guilt from the student, in that they don't think that they're just wasting a huge amount of money because they're being paid in student contracts. They're actually getting some sort of benefit in the form of scholarships and so on. It also prevents them from rushing into bad financial decisions out in a search or a hunt for financial security, right? Moreover, in terms of like better training, in that like we have better staff on our side, so less chances of injury and things like that, right? This is the bulk of material coming out from negative, which I don't think we receive a sufficient response to, aside from them saying, okay, student athletes don't actually get a lot of money, or they don't get any money in our world, but in their world somehow training is better and like more people participate. I think to the extent that they never actually ground like in this in fact at all, to the extent that I don't think like the professionalization of sport ever comes out clearly from their side, and why necessarily that's bad. I think that to that extent, they can't just claim to have won the majority of this debate. What did Affirmative then actually talk about? Firstly, in terms of casual players, and I think like and I think we dealt with this like to a huge extent, in that this is about like professional athletes participating in student leagues and things like that. But even then, even if it's about casual players, they will still continue to play. It's fun by their own mechanism. They're not scared off to the extent that they're still inspired, and they're not actually participating in leagues, and their health is like, so health and other considerations that they point to are rather irrelevant. Secondly, in terms of competitiveness and how that's like toxic, I think second negative spends considerable time in terms of telling you how this is symmetric in either world, but in our world, at least they get some sort of monetary reward in terms of scholarships or better training. I don't think there's a sufficient response to this in terms of them saying why exclusively in their world, like it's just less. I mean, sure, you're just playing for no reward. That doesn't necessarily mean that competitiveness a priori is a bad thing or something that doesn't exist in their world. So at worst, it's symmetric. At best, it's falls on our side. Thirdly, in terms of less popular sports, I think I conclusively dealt with this in terms of saying how overall the funding is decreased, so less popular sports get even less money. So unsure as to what like the mechanism is there in their world. But moreover, they also talk about like academics and stuff like that. I think to the extent that's a like fairly privileged notion, because your ability to afford a law school education or things like or join an Ivy League is completely contingent on your sort of social class that you're born into and the amount of generational wealth that you have. This is framing in first speech. Moreover, you can't pursue sports at any point in time because the temporal limits on a student athlete's body, like literally you can't pursue sports at 25, something that is impossible. To that extent, I think negated.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the affirmative reply speaker to conclude today's debate. Here.
Awesome. The first thing I'm going to do in this reply speech is whip the largest benefit in this debate, which is what happens to the majority of people who access amateur or social sports. Because we give you lots of reasons why people are currently scared off of entering sports. It is that professionalism makes it look increasingly like you have to be very good to play. It looks like a huge time sink when the most visible players play for hours every day at the sacrifice of all other activities, but also that all resources are spent on competitive and profitable teams, meaning the avenues to access social sport are cut off to do things like make fields available for your top teams. All of this means that fewer people are willing to play or encouraged to play by their friends and family, who all buy into the idea that to play sports means to sink in lots of times, so you ought not to risk your education if you aren't good. We make casual sports significantly more accessible for people. Even if 3N is right, and all this means is that people run around playing tag in university, that is a huge benefit. It is fun, it gives people access to exercise, and it gives them access to community. The only response to this from the negating team is that this benefit is symmetric because sports is still fun and people will access it. But this doesn't engage with the analysis we give you down the line about the dual function of sports, because you don't just access the fun of sports by playing it. Most people today only access it by watching, which doesn't unlock any of the health benefits we give you, but also minimizes community benefits. So don't ignore this reply, because none of these megs are new. Shar and Grace do a fantastic job responding to these contentions. Third neg adds some new good material about how this might apply discriminatorily. Unfortunately, Grace already responds to it when she says that schools like having reputations of being inclusive and diverse, but also just that cost does not matter because it is just having equipment available for social players to use. What this means for weighing this impact is that obviously it is not symmetric. We also massively expand the group of people that access sports by actually playing it. Given that professional sports still exists in this world, the biggest change is that you can make is encouraging millions or billions of people to pick up this team sports. I think even negating at their best, they do not provide a benefit that is this important. What we additionally add is improving education through the reallocation of funds that are currently spent on getting a shot at profit to other school activities. The premise of this is present right at first, right? Which is that schools currently funnel a lot of money into sports, more than is necessary. The only response comes out at third neg where they say profit gives you more money. But obviously this falsely assumes that all schools profit off of sports. We say that this opportunity cost obviously ought to be spent on things like education instead. What are the benefits though that they claim at their very best? It is that some players might achieve scholarships to access free university. Note that this doesn't give them money because that is professional leagues. They put in hours at the expense of their grades to play their sports, sacrificing their ability to access careers in anything other than sports when they graduate. Even if you look at this best case, it is a tiny group of people, right? Consider the trajectory of a student. When you're in high school, you invest hours in getting better, but only a few players get scholarships. The ones that are left behind are the ones that have injuries, that have sacrificed their grades and their ability to get into high schools, universities on the basis of academics. Those who then get to university have the same pressures applying on them, but only a few are able to go professional after. The people who are left behind don't necessarily have the best of degrees. So lots of people get left behind. And I think even at their best, neg does not demonstrate why the small group of people that do get success are more important. But importantly, what we tell you is that the monetary incentive to do well is what gives people a reason to push their bodies to the breaking point. Neg does not explain why this applies symmetrically in a world where you are not able to access monetary benefit from playing sport. Their final attempt to impact this is to say that the people who make it are often poor, but it is not an assertion that the NBA is majority middle class. It takes a lot of money to hire equipment and to hire coaches. The media obviously focuses on rags to riches stories, but if Serena and Venus did not succeed, their parents would have sacrificed everything for literally nothing. These are the untold stories of professionalized sports, and it is unclear to me that this negating team is ever able to prove that they get success for the majority of people. We open up access to community for everyone. We open up access to actual fun. I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you everyone for the debate. Please head back to the main room and we'll be back in 10 to 15 minutes or so with the result. Thank you, everyone.
Sorry, since this is a streaming room, I'll be guiding the judges to the breakdown rooms, and everyone else just stay here.
All right, we'll do that instead.
I'll be guiding you guys to a breakout room, and then everyone else just stay here.
Have we got Auckland here? All right, see Auckland. And have we got JGU?
Yeah,
Yep, we are here.
Awesome. All right. Was there a third person from the JGU team, or are we good to go?
We're good to go.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the debate. That was quite a close debate and quite an interesting one. I'm actually going to give the result, and then I'll give the general feedback and the reasoning, because I think the general feedback will make more sense once I can give the result and not have to try and hide the result in the general feedback. So on a very close margin, we both agreed, and the debate went to the affirmative team. Congratulations. In terms of general feedback then, I think the big thing about this debate is that both teams, I guess, had really big holes in their cases that were there to be exploited by the other team, but just weren't, which I think made the decision a lot harder to make and made the debate a lot closer, particularly as teams kind of danced around or got closest to it. So I think the big thing to think about is that a lot of this case, I guess, from the affirmative team sort of jumps over the premise that universities will change the way they treat and think about sport, or schools rather, that players will change the way they think about it and that fans will change the way they think about it just because it's de-professionalized. which I think, and then all the case sort of runs off that idea, but it's not really ever addressed as to whether or not that incentive change would happen. So I think there's a huge space there that Negative could have exploited to jump in and say, well, actually, none of the incentives around the university's approach to sport will change, which means therefore none of your benefits occur. I think, but unfortunately, that sort of analysis doesn't come out from Negative, which means that we're kind of like ultimately judging based off the characterization that AFTR's kind of asserted or run off, even if it was a bit loose and a bit underproven, which makes it a bit harder. So making sure you're actually thinking about all the people that are likely to be involved in this, how they're all likely to react. It's not like a preferring a world motion. This is a policy motion that we would tomorrow de-professionalize all these sports. So there's a lot more scope in the debate that wasn't explored that could have made it a lot more interesting. The second thing,
Rob?
Yeah?
Can you hear me, Rob?
Who's speaking? Oh, sorry, I'm in a Discord with Grace. Hang on. Sorry, this is bad. Sorry, that was so strange. I had the Discord unmuted. I was in a voice channel. I just heard this voice from Grace calling out my name, and it really threw me. Where was I? Oh, this is great. It's all going to be on the recording now for everyone to watch. Hello, world. So, building up that, then I think there needs to be a lot more about what that change is and why we get to that change of the world around that enables all the rest of your arguments that are well made, well explained, well impacted to actually occur. And in a responsive sense, teams need to think about how do I then happen and step in there. And the last piece of general feedback is just, I think at times some key claims from teams weren't really being rebutted or engaged in properly. In terms of the result, then, the first thing I want to talk about, I guess, is participation, firstly, at a general level of how people will get more involved in sport. I think the affirmative team, the professionalization of sport is likely to make participate in it. The assumption that you have to put a lot of money into it, a lot of time into it, that it requires a lot of effort and a lot of work, because there's huge pressure involved with the professionalization of sport, because the expectation is you win, you work hard, and that compromises things like grades, free time, health, etc., because you're constantly pushed so hard, and that dissuades a lot of people from being a part of it. I think all the benefits of being a part of sport are unlimited and flow from that naturally. The actual clash is about whether or not that change of participation happens. I think the negative makes some reasonable claims in response to say that, like, well, people like sports, are likely to participate in it because, you know, they enjoy it and it's fun. I think the problem was I think it was a bit of a flippant assertion from the negative, sort of to leave it at that. I think the conception of what the sort of sports we're talking about, the team atmosphere, the playing and being involved, the spreading out of resources in the fields, etc., I think go beyond a bit of what the characterization was that seemed to come from negative around just like people play. It's fun. I think they need to do a bit more to actually explain, like, was that like structured fun? Was it in teams? Was it just people mucking around with a cricket bat or a soccer ball, in the playground? What was it a similar enough level that it met the sort of benefits just mucking around and playing? So I think and even if we believe a lot of that negative stuff, I think that is still mitigatory at best. I don't think it fully defeats the point that there are a lot of reasons as to why you will be dissuaded from playing sport at school. There is such a huge pressure and assumption upon what the requirements of that participation in sport is when it is professionalized. So that model probably mitigates, but ultimately I don't think defeats that general participation point. And again, to bring it back to feedback again, that point kind of assumes that the focus of universities is likely to change back to the quote, the first affirmative, the olden days of how sport used to be community and fun, which I don't think is proven that universities change, but also I think it's contested that universities likely change back to that. So I think ultimately, even if mitigated, that general participation point probably falls to the affirmative team. The second question is still on participation, but it's about like that equity of participation, about who actually gets involved in sports, and deals more with the actual athletes' conception around sport. So I think negative team makes some pretty good paths to why for a lot of lower socioeconomic people, going into sport is seen as a pathway out. and the likelihood of success. So they can go in there, and that's only possible with professionalization, I think, is the thing to add on, because they get scholarships, they get extra money to support them going through college and things like that. That is particularly useful. I think that's probably to some extent true, that does help a lot of people like try and pursue their sporting dreams. I guess the first response is just kind of this like factual assertion battle about like where on the socioeconomic ladder people in the NBA sit, whether they're middle class, whether they're poorer, and it's hard to adjudicate when both are just like it is this factor, it's that fact. I think I'm possibly more towards the affirmative team because they suggest things like the cost of like having trainers, the cost of having access to equipment, and there's lots of other barriers that mean you're still not likely to reach your full capacity and reach that top level if you are at a lower socioeconomic position, because there's all the on that like factual back and forth. But I think the second and bigger part of this participation is the material we hear from Affirmative about I guess the opportunity cost that comes around the professionalization of sports. They make a claim that because it's professionalized, people see it as a pathway to a career, to being a successful sports star, to earning lots of money through that. But regardless of where you sit on the economic ladder, the likelihood of your chance of success is likely to be quite low. I think they point to examples of just like how big the college and university sport pool is, but then how few of them actually make it to the much professional leagues after that, which I think then brings in a lot of their additional opportunity cost harms to those people. So it is the illusion of success that drives a lot of people to going into pursuing this professionalized sport at school. That means that they miss out on academic opportunities to expand, like they over prioritize that over their grades and things like that. I think it's reasonable for the negative team to sort of say, well, academics is also competitive and it's also likely to be a hard field to get into as a lawyer or a doctor. But I think more needed to be done to actually explain, I guess, a bit more like why it was like equally as competitive, or why I guess the problem is it's like, yes, it is competitive to be in an academic sense, but if you're not dedicating like 80% of your time to training for sport, then you probably have a better chance of being better in that academic sense than you do in the world where you're dedicating all that time to sport, which means that is more of a problem for these people. And because the opportunity cost of actually being successful in the long run is so limited, it did seem like it was more of a harm for those people. And then even people who are likely to have a lot of money to succeed in the sport, they probably don't change a lot in the debate because they can just keep going in either world. So I think then on the participation equity front, I think again negative makes some ground there and does mitigate. I think it presents some good reasons as to why it would help poor people. I think ultimately Affirmative is able to edge out for the reasons I talked about. The last thing then, I guess, is the harms of the participation then, which I've kind of already half done with the opportunity cost. This is kind of like the issue that covers the rest of the harms. There is a lot of there's a claim from Affirmative here about, there's higher risk of injuries if you participate in sport. There's lost costs like pursuing academia, and I think they impact the ongoing harms of that sport particularly well when they talk about like the dementia with the concussions or the damage to like dislocating shoulders if you damage those muscles sufficiently and significantly over time. I think negative makes a good point that like a lot of this metric, a lot of this will occur on both sides because people will pursue sport recreationally anyway. I think that's probably true for some people, that like it is symmetric. And the question is just how different is it likely to be between the two worlds, which is where I think the negative kind of misses a bit of an opportunity to win the debate in this area. Because I think just saying it's symmetric is all contingent upon the idea that there's similar enough number of people are likely to be playing it at a similar enough level of intensity such that they incur these sorts of harms, which I don't think negative is able to do, which I think means that there is still some degree of difference. Now, obviously, there's still likely to be injury risk even if you're playing recreationally or playing for fun in the affirmative world. I think they make the good point, the negative team, that if more people play and you have less money, then you're able to afford like medical staff, and that actually makes the injuries worse. I think there are two responses from the affirmative team, though, that mitigate those harms out. The first being that they just point to the info slide topic where we'd still pay medical staff like a livable wage. So there'd still be some access to staff. It doesn't fix it entirely, but I think it's I think the second mitigation, which probably tips it over the line, is the idea that if there is no professionalization, if there is less of a competitive aspect to it, if you're training less, working less hard, etc., in all these areas, then for a lot of people, it probably does massively reduce their risk of injury and things like that, because the whole focus of the sport is likely to be less competitive and less full on, which again is like a question that could be answered for either team if we deal with the issue of how the sport is played and pursued. But given that question wasn't in the debate, I think that last issue, that last thing I said falls to the affirmative team. The last thing I want to talk about then is a couple of the other things that I couldn't quite fit into the issues. I think the biggest of that being like the way in which the different sports are prioritized by schools as a consequence of this. Because I think the negative argument about how women's sport is likely to be the first thing to be cut in pursuit of this. They pursue prioritize men's sport. And I think plausibly true. I think the kind of characterize why universities spread out the money across different areas and to different groups. But I think the problem was ultimately wasn't like a decisive victory to either team or a decisive issue in the debate, is it just doesn't get enough airtime or enough waiting to sort of explain why this is likely to be the consequence and why this is likely to be the most important outcome in the debate. And given we'd already had such a discussion around access for everyone else, around the quality of participation and around the opportunity cost that exists participating in the sport, it was hard to credit like these last couple of issues enough to genuinely sway the debate or change things. So ultimately, I don't think they made a massive impact on the decision, but worth mentioning here. All right, sorry if that was a bit confusing and sorry for the interruption earlier, but I hope it all made sense. If anyone would like feedback, please hit me up on Discord. I will aim to try and get back to you as soon as, hopefully before round 4 or 5, but if not, definitely before day 3. It depends how much time I've got in between rounds. But as I said, well done, very close debate. You're both excellent teams, and I wish you all the best for the rest of Australs. Thanks, everyone.